Hey everybody, this is Stuart, and I'm here with a. Hey everybody, this is Stuart, and I'm here with a quick disclaimer, which I haven't had to do for, I don't know, 4 or 5 episodes now. The interview you were about to hear was something that we originally recorded for our Teach Me About the Great Lakes election special that we released a couple weeks ago. However, we didn't end up talking about the election that much, and so as a result, I just decided to release it as a separate episode because I think it stands on its own just fine. In fact, I think it's a really interesting conversation about environmental politics in the Great Lakes region and some stuff on the Upper Peninsula that I had no idea existed, plus a cool sandwich story. So, all around, it's a great episode on its own. So, thank you for listening. Please take a minute, if you can, to give us a review or a subscription, or maybe you tell your friends about us, and stay safe this holiday season. It's starting to get a little nuts out there. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back, everybody, to Teach Me About the Great Lakes. Unless I screw something up, this is part 2 of our election special. It's election season. Everybody's getting fired up to vote. Hopefully you have voted. If you haven't, hopefully you will vote. But I wanted to talk with some people who know more about politics in the Great Lakes than I do, because we spend a lot of time thinking about what a wonderful resource this is, a cultural and environmental and economic resource. Well, politics ties right into that. And so I thought we would call up some folks who are smarter about that than I am and talk to them about it. And so I'm pleased to introduce today's guest, who is Dr. Camden Bird. He is an assistant professor of history at Eastern Illinois University, home of New Orleans Saints head coach Sean Payton, as I'm sure you knew. Camden, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks. We're in the home stretch now, election-wise. And so I don't know. I guess your job doesn't really have you necessarily following it all that closely, but I'm still feeling it, man. That's what it is. Still feeling it.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I'm, following everything as closely as I can. Still have to write lectures now and again and teach. But yeah, I mean, it's an energizing time.
Yeah. Energizing time is one way to phrase it. So let's sort of look at. So you're a professor of history, not poli-sci, but you're looking at kind of environment and politics in the Midwest and elsewhere, maybe. And so my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, is that your research sort of explores the interaction between nature, business, and culture, especially in like the 19th century. So what can you tell me about how do people view the Great Lakes kind of, in the early days of America or the 19th century? How do people interact with or view the Great Lakes then?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of it is, and you're right to point out, I study sort of the history of humans' relationship to the natural environment over time. And to be 100%, accurate, there's not one way that people view it, because it often depends on who we're talking about, their cultural baggage, their desires for the natural environment, and their preconceived notions about what nature is supposed to be. So really what I do is study different groups and how they perceive the environment, how they hope to harness it or not at all, and how that relationship changes over time, because it does, in fact, change over time. So it's also that question of history is, just because this group felt this way about it at one point, how does that change? What sort of encourages changing perceptions to occur? And sort of essentially I am a historian. We study change over time. So that's very much a question that I'm interested in. So broadly speaking, if we're talking about the 19th century and we're talking about early America in the 19th century, the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes region was seen as sort of this duality of both daunting in its sort of rugged, wild, untamed wilderness, but also potentially very profitable. I'm thinking if you were to go back and read, let's say, the journals of Henry Schoolcraft, who was an early naturalist and an explorer who was tasked to sort of go through the Great Lakes region and see what was going on in the early 1820s, he would have sort of hit you with descriptions that are both he sees the Grand Sable Dunes and he talks about it as being desolate, barren, devoid of life up in the UP, but then also seeing, evidence of French or Native American agriculture and seeing this as a potential for development that, certainly not for Native Americans. Let's be clear, Henry Schoolcraft and part of that American imperial agenda was to open it up for Americans and Euro-Americans broadly. But it was wilderness to be tamed and turned into profitable landscapes.
Okay. And so I don't know this Schoolcraft. I'll have to read about him. But so the idea was that it was devoid of life, but life defined as, white European dudes.
Right.
Well,
Right.
and they're women folk, I suppose.
Yes.
Right. Okay. It would be something to look at agriculture, see the signs of ag. Life is elsewhere.
It's potential, but it's not as enlightened or civilized as perhaps as he would see it to be. Yes.
Yeah, and so I was up on the UP, so there was no Sault Ste. Marie then, or maybe there was, I don't know. And so there's the duality of like this nature and the frontier. And if I hadn't been fixing the YouTube link, I would have heard the second part of that duality. However, I was fixing the YouTube link, so the second part of that duality is.
So the duality of being sort of wilderness, scary frontier, but also very sort of there's a ton of potential in this area, right? Like they know that the fish runs are incredible in the Great Lakes, that this could be harnessed somehow, if there's a way to get these to a market that can use them. There's a lot of technological issues there, but early on, that's certainly a concern and seen as a growth opportunity.
Yeah, it really was. And so back then in the 19th century, do you know how far like west people had explored in terms of up in the Great Lakes? So the UP was new. Where else and again, by people, I have the very specific definition of Europeans.
Yeah.
So
no, it's a great question. And obviously, Native Americans, this is their homeland, traditional homelands. They've used this landscape, know it very well. The French, though, have been tromping around in the Great Lakes region throughout the 17th century and know it very well, too. Sault Ste. Marie, right? Mm-hmm. This is a French town, French settlement name. And so by the time, Americans are really sort of moving into and exploring this region, not only are they seeing plenty of evidence of Native American culture, but they're also seeing evidence of French Canadian culture that is still existent in the region as well. Yeah.
And so when you talk about potential, again, it seems to me like we're getting this idea that strike me as very big in the 19th and 20th centuries about like harnessing but dominating nature for our benefit, right? Or another good example would be the Erie Canal, which I think you've done a little bit of work on. And that's another thing where you're building a canal and you're constructing something so that we can control nature, right? Was that a big kind of theme of the early days?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the 19th century mentality, except for some outliers that we can talk about, maybe some romantics. But the idea was like, what good is all this potential if we're not capitalizing on it? Which is to say something like the Erie Canal, which is going to be critical to open up the Great Lakes region for trade and commerce by making it possible for farmers and other goods to actually move to eastern seaports where it could be sold and actually be a valued commodity. And I think that's a key point there is the natural goods are valued based on their potential market worth. And sort of maximizing that is the key here in the 19th century.
I see. And so the big idea was we got to get these goods, get this potential, and then get it to the population centers through whatever means necessary, by hook or by crook, I suppose, or by train or by, well, there weren't planes.
Train, canal boats, all of it.
Yeah, yes, you name ships. It. Yeah, there's going to be mules involved. Ships. He said ships, people. Yeah, they're mules. I know that. Yeah.
Sorry, is that a boat? I know there's a critical distinction there.
No, I don't know. I just wanted to be sure. We've had 2 episodes in a row with a euphemistic spit, and so. We wanted to be very clear about what was being said. You mentioned romantics. Let's talk about the couple outlier romantics. So who were these romantics who maybe felt differently?
I mean, certainly we can talk about, and it's a complicated relationship because nature can mean different things, but you have people who are clearly skeptical of the sort of purely market-driven philosophy. And some of the biggest ones, when I teach an environmental history course, American environmental history course, you can't ignore people like Thoreau, right? Who's very uncomfortable with an increasingly market-driven society, so much so that he sees it as disorienting. He sees it as sort of a degradation to the human spirit. And so he's just going to go out, this is in New England, not in the Great Lakes region, but he's just going to walk out and, go live and be a bean farmer, or plant beans and live out in Walden Pond for 2 years and explore that life. I mean, obviously you think about someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who's interested in conservation. You see the rise of the Forest Service at the turn of the 20th century as well. Obviously, John Muir, who is very much a romantic in the sense that he sees nature, specifically the Sierra Nevadas, but he sees nature as a cathedral. He sees it as this is where you meet God, not at church. So,
yeah, but it's already right. It didn't occur to me, but of course, you're talking about kind of the roots of the whole environmental thing in the United States, and like the preservation versus conservation, Gilbert, what's his name, and John Muir, and all that stuff. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Gilbert and Show and all. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you see that in the Great Lakes themselves, and you have that. There was really the idea, it seems from what you're telling me, of using nature for what it's worth. Whether or not people were thinking about conservation and wise use, or just sucking it till it's dry, it's not clear to me necessarily.
Yeah, and especially in the Great Lakes. And I will say you have this transformation that occurs in the second half of the 19th century, particularly in the upper Midwest, right? Okay. These are logging areas. They're not as good as agricultural. So they are actually seen as, for various reasons, an escape from modern life, escape from urban centers like Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee. And you see an entire tourism industry that has redefined what the healthful benefits of nature are, and specifically talking about the upper Midwest as a healthful retreat from the over anxieties of urban living, right? So in many ways, that time period is redefining what the role of particular natural landscapes can mean to American culture. So you see a reinvention of the idea of nature in that sense.
Really? Huh. I didn't realize that was kind of a novel idea at the time. This notion of nature as refuge, right? Which we think about a lot as we don't get to spend as much time in nature or travel as far. There's not a lot of beautiful nature in West Lafayette. There's some, but it'd be really great to be able to go and spend some weeks at a place, but that's just not really on the table right now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So then we have environment as, of course, something that we, should dominate and control. In order to expand society, produce more. And we have environment as refuge. But it was later, much later. Well, I don't know how much later was it when we started to think of the environment, either generally in the Great Lakes, as something that we are affecting in a negative way. Because about the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, Rachel Carson and what have you. Was there a lead up to that, or do you see that anywhere in the Great Lakes?
Yeah, what's interesting about what makes like the 60s and 70s era different than previous conservation efforts, because I will say, especially in the Great Lakes region, again, in the upper Midwest is what I'm most familiar with, but you start to see conservation districts, right? You're going to see national forests get put into place. I believe like the Hiawatha National Forest is in the 1930s. You're going to start to see, even during the Great Deal, the Depression era, and you have federal programs that are rebuilding, destroyed ecosystems because of, rampant capitalism of lumber mining and lumbering and mining and whatnot. So there is precedent. What I will say is about the 60s and 70s was where some of those efforts were about conservation of pure natural resources. The 60s and 70s will see sort of a chemical element brought into the conversation in an unprecedented way, which is to say the question of, well, two things, right? How does a chemical affect the environment or potentially human health, right? Because that's a big part of this as well. But then you start to see the rise of like ecology as a science, as opposed to environment as a particular science. Not that environment's not a science, but the notion that all these organisms are connected and related, and it complicates, notions of conservation, which is to say, if you're a Forest Service conservation person, you're interested about trees. You're not necessarily interested about specific birds. You're not interested, or lichen or things like that. That starts to change during this time period as well. And it throws off sort of that that relationship that people have built to their landscape in some ways.
Oh, that's interesting. Huh. So with the rise of ecological sciences, what you're really seeing is a more holistic, I guess, view of how things work. I was talking to some students the other day at a high school, and we were talking about, conserving individual species, and I was describing the importance of habitat or whatever. And of course, that's that exact thing. It never even occurred to me because I'm kind of stupid. Okay.
Well, no, I think it makes sense. There's a history to these things, and that's the reality of it. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And so then, but so in the Great Lakes specifically, as the environmental region took off, this is also the seat of so many industries, right? In the 60s and 70s, you think of steel, and I don't know the exact history here, but there's steel, there's the auto, there's all these extractive industries, probably because of just what you're saying. Everybody saw the wonderful natural resource and they're like, heck yeah, let's send them back east, baby. And but this is the economy. In many ways, right? And Michigan, I don't know a ton about Michigan, but you think about Michigan specifically, it has that duality right there where or maybe it's a different duality where it's like unbelievably beautiful place to go, but also we're taking everything we can for cars and whatever. So was the environmental movement, I imagine that was met with a little bit of resistance, at least in some places in the Great Lakes region.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you've absolutely nailed the sort of how shattering environmental movements or conservation and preservation movements can be, because in many cases you have, especially in the upper Midwest, and that's not even just Michigan, but places like Minnesota as well, where there is both great timber to be harvested, but you also have historically prolific iron mines in those regions too. And the iron is the backbone of the economy of many of those towns, many of those communities. And absolutely, to mine is is potentially a very harmful environmental action, and it is necessary for local economies. But it is, if you're balancing the notion of environmental preservation against mining, that's a tough line to sort of navigate there, and it does come with some political pushback. And this is an article that I had written for this recent collection of the history of conservative politics in the Upper Midwest. Is this conversation of what does the environmental movement do to the economy, and how does that get politicized?
Yeah. And so I forgot to plug the article in the book in the very beginning. So yes, Camden, much like the guest from part 1 of our politics extravaganza, contributed a chapter to this book called, I will look up the title, and I linked to it in the show note, Conservative Heartland, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. The Conservative Heartland, a political history of post-war the post-war American Midwest. And we'll have a link to that. You should check that book out. It's actually, I've read bits of it as prepping for this, and it's very interesting stuff.
It's timely too, I'd say. I've seen bits of what you did with the previous interview and talking about the timeliness of the debates of the Midwest as swing state, as politically relevant. I mean, it's a great publication for understanding today.
Yeah, no, that's great.
There's my plug too.
Yeah, there you go. So go get the book. This is 2 times in a row. Just buy the book. It's not that expensive. Or get it from the library. I don't care. But anyway, so we did spend some time with Chris Devine talking about, how the Midwest is a battleground. And one thing that didn't occur to me is one of the reasons that the Midwest is a battleground is because it could go either way, right? So many of the states, you're not a battleground, Alabama is not going to be a battleground, or Louisiana, where I come from, is not going to be a presidential battleground, at least on a consistent basis going forward. And so, but is part of that, and this may be outside your field, so you can tell me if so, is part of the reason that it's so close, it has to do with this relationship you're talking about, where on the one hand, we're extracting and using, and on the other hand, it's all this beautiful place where people want to preserve, and it's sort of that dual nature right there. Do you think that contributes to kind of the closeness of a lot of the politics in the region?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that was really sort of the heart of the question that I started with that essay, is to say the traditional sort of, the brief rundown of the political history of the Midwest is essentially, you have your New Deal coalition, which is Democratic voters who are very pro-union. They're very industrial workforce, blue collar. And that is why, knowing the history of places in the Midwest, Illinois, Michigan, Milwaukee, these are industrial centers that tend to obviously support policies that are supporting of blue collar workers. As you start to see a variety of forces that come about in the 60s and the 70s, those politics start to shift, and has made this region more of a battleground than obviously, as you said, your home state of Louisiana. And so I was interested in the traditional narrative as you've got social unrest in the 60s, you've got Vietnam War, which starts to shake things up. You have the rise of this new political left in the 60s as well. And it starts to shatter things. But what I was hoping to answer with this essay was to say, well, what about the politics of environmentalism, which have been largely ignored in the American Midwest political history, and in fact have almost focused exclusively on places out west, places that are huge, huge swaths of land owned by the federal government. And the traditional narrative is that an anti-environmental politics starts to build in the 70s out west, with people critiquing how much the federal government owns, how much wilderness preservation is happening, and the backlash starts out there. I was interested in what happens when environmentalism comes to the mining regions of the upper Midwest.
Right. And so the narrative is that there's backlash out west. I mean, you can still see that going on today with some of what's happening with the Bureau of Land Management, that BLM protests and things like that. And so what is the deal with the anti-environmentalism in the Midwest? Did you find that it was a significant seed of it, maybe because of some of what we've been talking about, or what?
Yeah, it was interesting, and there's this really it's almost, it's funny when I wrote the history, because if you live like north of the 45th parallel in the upper Midwest, you sort of know the history. You at least know that at certain points in American history, the Upper Peninsula itself has attempted to secede from the state of Michigan. And I was sort of interested in this. This is sort of in some ways seen as like poppy history and not sort of kookiness. But I was interested in sort of studying that as a real historical phenomenon by saying, okay, who is this? Who's leading this? How serious is this movement? And what are they talking about? And it started by doing some research up at Northern Michigan University. They have great archives up there, and I can't promote them enough. But the papers of a state rep named Dominic Jacobetti, who was on paper like a classic New Deal Democrat. He is he's raised in the UP in Negaunee, which is a very steel mining town. He works in the mines after he graduates from high school. He rises the ranks of the local union organization, becomes the president of the union. It's following that sort of very blue collar. He's a Democrat, but he starts to break away from the party line when these environmental issues, these environmental laws start coming into place. Particularly things like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, because he sees these as potentially damaging to the industries of steel mining in the Upper Peninsula. And so he starts a backlash. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's good. That makes sense, right? Because so the local issues for him take over. Anyway, I was going to try and draw some parallels to current, but I don't actually know it well enough, so I don't want to speak out of turn.
It's absolutely right, which is to say he sees himself still as a New Deal Democrat, but this issue is starting to change that coalition in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so much so that he is going to begin in the late 60s to organize, in 70s, he's going to organize a secession movement.
Okay, now this is interesting. So he was going to organize a secession, like secede like from the U.S. or become your own from Michigan?
He wanted to be his own state.
His own state.
He wanted the UP to be the 51st state, the state of Superior.
Superior.
Yes. And so he starts organizing, right? And this is a grassroots movement. And he does this a few different ways, right? He's reaching out to local industry leaders to start having them talk about why environmental laws are bad, right? He's reaching out to them. Hey, like this Clean Water Act, this Clean Air Act, like talk to me. How is this going to hurt you? Right. He's seeking for them to inform his sort of political movement and he gets the answers he wants. He gets people saying, like, energy companies saying, oh, well, like we'll have to pass these on to the consumers. And we have to understand that, like, in the 1960s, we have underground mines that are going out of business because mining out west is taking off. It's much easier out west. Like this mining in this part of the country has been going on for 100 years. You got to go pretty deep down to find it in the upper Midwest. So it's much easier to get it out west. Or you have steel coming in from places like China.
Yep.
And so it's just the economy's collapsing. He's looking for someone to put this on, and it is going to be environmental laws and environmentalism that it's going to be the target.
Yeah, that often is the target there, without commenting on the wisdom of that. And so, because I'm not allowed to. So So what was the strategy there? So the idea is these are bad, so we're going to pull out of Michigan, but you're still going to be subjected to the laws, right?
So subject, yes, subject to the federal laws, but not subject to, because also the state of Michigan is passing a series of laws at this time period as well, which they see as just too much. And so therefore, the logic is, well, you have a local community who might not be so interested in enforcing some of these laws, because
Right.
a lot of the EPA rules, like especially require sort of a motivating body to sue or
Yeah.
monitor environmental hazards. And so the notion is that we can dodge the Michigan stuff, at least if we become this 51st state.
Yeah. And if it's a more laissez-faire place for a lot
Right.
of that.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not going to be, yes, local communities aren't going to be inclined to, shut down the mine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's interesting. And so they wanted to create the state of Superior, which is just wonderfully named. If you're going to name yourself something, you might as well roll, right? And so obviously it didn't happen. Were they that close to it, or were they close to getting it done?
The closest they got was in this 70s, the 70s push. And again, like historically thinking, the 70s are, this is the time of incredible recession. The economy, you have stagflation. It's a bad time to be in America in the 70s. It's an anxious time. This is also when you see national politicians start to flip on environmental issues. What used to be a bipartisan agreement to get at some of these environmental rules will start to turn more partisan in the 1970s because of these economic issues. Yeah.
Okay. Because I've always wondered about that. Like how did the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, those would never pass today in a bipartisan way.
Right.
And so I've always kind of wondered, and I didn't know if it was because that was also when Watergate was happening, and so there was a need to be seen pushing back. But you're saying that it didn't really become partisan environmentalism. Well, the specific mechanisms by which we try to achieve environmental quality or whatever didn't become partisan until a bit later then, or it was later in the 70s. Okay.
Yeah, and there's a great book if anyone's interested in this. It's called The Republican Reversal, which is also tracking sort of the long-term historical trends of conservative politics and sort of the laws of it. And it complicates the narrative quite a bit, doesn't sort of simplify it. But yes, the broad strokes are the 70s start to flip things around with some minor successes since then, as far as if you're, environmentally minded. But as far as the UP goes, they did get the Attorney General of the state of Michigan to weigh in and say, okay, what steps do you need to take to become a separate state? And one of those, there's three things. You have to get the majority of the residents of the Upper Peninsula to agree to secession. You have to write a constitution. The U.S. Congress has to approve it. And then, of course, the state of Michigan also has to vote and approve it as well. Those are significant hurdles.
Yeah.
They never quite make it to the second task, because Jacobetti will start sending out these these questionnaires, these promotional flyers saying why we need to become a separate state, and really gauging the interest of local residents to how serious are you, right? There's always sort of this lingering downstate tension with those who live in the Upper Peninsula. And so, but early on, it became clear that the budgets couldn't possibly make it work. Like who's going to pay for the roads? Who's going to pay for the universities and colleges? What about hospitals? Like the tax base of the Upper Peninsula simply does need downstate urban centers to help fund those things that they've come to appreciate.
Yeah, I've been there. There's not a lot going on in terms of population. I mean, there's a bridge and a lock and a lot of woods, and that's wonderful, but it's not driving the whole state, I guess.
Exactly.
So is there a separatist movement today, or a secessionist movement today still? Are people still fired up about this?
It lingers. It does linger, and it tends to happen. It tends to get louder during a recession, right? So you did have a bit of some mumblings about it in, let's say, after the 2008 recession. There was a group of people who were interested in this. It tends to, and by no means am I trying to sort of sound political, but it is often a libertarian sort of argument of sort of like manage our own sources, be our own economy, our local. It's very local. when I published this piece, I mean, I got a few emails from people saying like, "Thank you for giving, calling attention to this history. We still need to do it." And I don't think I advocated for secession at any point in my piece, but I think they read into that perhaps. But I would say it's still there. There are people on Twitter who advocate for it, whatever that means, and I think you'll see signs around every once in a while.
Interesting. I had no idea this was a thing. So that's fascinating to hear about. So let's shift gears minorly. There's something else I wanted to ask you about. So one thing we talk about a lot is methods here, because I love to hear about how people do their work, whether that's, and usually what we end up doing is saying, we need to fund more scientists to collect more data because it's all important. But you call yourself a digital humanist. And I will be honest, even though I was an English major and spent a lot of times around the humanities, I think I must be old enough that digital humanism did not exist when I was in college, or if it did, they didn't tell me about it. Maybe it's too powerful a tool for me. So how do you use digital tools to study humanities and histories? What kind of questions can you explore and stuff? Like, how is that different from, just going to the archives, which you like to do, but what is unlocked in the digital era, I guess?
Stuart, I can assure you, as you who does science, I can assure you the technology that a lot of humanists are doing are, in fact, well in your wheelhouse. We are just playing catch up in many ways. Digital humanists, as far as I see it, and this obviously is a big tent.
Yeah, no, it's no, it's my own ignorance. I'm sure that. Yeah.
But my philosophy there is, and I am a sort of trained cultural historian, which is I am interested in sort of the feelings, the meanings, how people construct identity and things like that. So it's not always conducive to the methodological approaches of digital humanities. I'm interested in using digital humanities to combine large data sometimes to sort of add depth and meaning to some of the cultural history questions that we ask of the time period. So, projects that I'm interested in are going back in historical records of, old bureaus or old associations, looking at the statistics that they're throwing around at the specific time period, recovering some of those statistics to get a sense of real physical, material changes that are happening in natural environments as they're recording that. This is data that, is published. It's not accessible without either great machine learning and or the skills of historians, which are just digging in the archives for hours and copying over data to databases.
I see. So you'll go and look at just old not ancient literally, metaphorically ancient reports and find out what's there, and then essentially create data sets that you can then analyze that were otherwise just buried in books or maybe in PDFs if you're lucky.
And my philosophy is that data will give us more information than we had before to start talking about meanings and cultural history. Yeah. I'm still, I have to, in case my former advisor were ever to see this, I am not sort of like this techno-optimist, techno-determinist. I very much believe that, that this is just more evidence that we can use to reconstruct the past, right? Because the more evidence we have, the better idea we might have of how people lived, experienced, and knew the natural world of yesterday.
That's fascinating stuff. It really is. But that's actually, Camden, not why we invited you here on Teach Me About the Great Lakes. The reason that we invited you here to Teach Me About the Great Lakes is there are two questions. The first of which is this.
Oh, yeah.
If you could choose to have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch, which one would you choose and why?
Oh, I'm going to hit you in the middle ground there, Stuart.
Boy.
I'm going to plug. This is maybe my biggest accomplishment while I lived in Rochester, where I did do my graduate studies. As you probably know, the dissertation needs to write. You need to sit down. You need time. There was a great coffee shop / brewery called Fifth Frame in downtown Rochester that I would spend my weekends writing in the morning. So it was coffee only. I just need to make sure. Okay, good. Okay.
I was more intrigued than ever before. It was like, this is an avenue. Hold on, the podcast has now changed. All right, so it's in Rochester, the Fifth?
It's in Rochester. The name is Fifth Frame.
Fifth Frame.
I am a vegetarian, and they mostly had meat-based breakfast sandwiches, so I kept custom ordering just an egg sandwich. And after about a year of this, they finally added the bird, B-U-R-D, to the menu. And this is still the greatest thing that's ever happened to me in the city of Rochester. I've got a sandwich named after me. And then I like moved away like 2 days later, but it happened. It's real. It's still there. It's on the menu.
Oh,
You can take it to go, don't have to sit there.
I am at their website now. I encourage everybody listening to look down at your telephone or whatever and find this out. The Bird. This is amazing. We have never interviewed a celebrity before. This is just.
And I suspect if you actually ask them why they named it there, that local story is gone. But it's just because that's the name they saw on the credit card every time we custom ordered this thing.
There it is. 2 eggs, cheddar. Now I do notice they call it a bastard roll. So I don't know if that's a little something for you. Look at that. 2 eggs and cheddar on a bastard. Nice.
Yes. So that's I will endorse that all day. And Rochester's a great town. Great Lakes city that people don't often assume is a Great Lakes city, but I will say it is.
There we go. Look at that, the bird. Okay, great. I've gotten totally distracted. The second, we have to redo this whole deal. No, the second question is this. What is one piece of life advice that you have for our listeners? It could be big or small, serious or silly. We like to give somebody something to take home and sort of think about, in addition to reflecting on the environmental history of the Great Lakes and, digital humanities. What's a bit of life advice from Dr. Camden?
Oh, wow, that's tough. Listen, we are in COVID times. We are in lockdown mode. I have gone deep into the well of podcasts. Like I'm a pretty regular podcast listener, but I feel like I've really tried to find new ones or interesting ones that are really good at narrating stories. And I actually think one that is applicable. It's not Great Lakes focused, but does get at sort of an environmental history of community engagement with this rise of ecology science and in the modern environmental movement is this new one. It's put out of Portland, Oregon, I believe. It's called Timber Wars.
Timber Wars.
Yeah, so it's about like this larger debate between environmentalists and local logging communities. And I think it's really well done. It's a great environment. Like I will assign it to an environmental history class because it's a great story and gets at some of the larger questions of and debates about environmentalism.
Well, that is really cool. That is some great advice. Go listen to that Timber Wars. That's any book about wars, like in general, but not actual wars. Those are not book. I guess here it's a podcast. I'm not as interested in actual wars because that's too intimidating for me. But other that sounds really great.
It is not. Yes, no formal war though. I from what I've listened to, the tensions get high and perhaps get a little violent, but not war violent.
I've got enough violence in my day-to-day existence. I don't need more. Wonderful. Well, Camden, great. I know you're on Twitter at Camden Bird with a U, not with an I or a Y. And we'll link to that. Is there anywhere else that people can go to find out more about your work? My personal website, which is very complicated, www.camdenbird.com. Nailed it.
You can get all my publications are there, and feel free. I mean, if anyone's interested in reading my work or, ideas about where to go for environmental history in general, I'd be happy to, suggest books or whatever.
Wonderful. Well, everybody do that. And also make sure to go check out the book that Camden and Part 1's guest, Dr. Chris Devine, contributed chapters to. It's called The Conservative Heartland, A Political History of the Post-War American Midwest. Dr. Camden Bird of Eastern Illinois University, thank you so much for coming on and teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
Yes, thank you, Stuart. This was great.